The first time anyone in Briar Creek heard Elsie Whitaker make a sound after 2 years of silence, it was not for a doctor, not for a preacher, and not for her own father. It was for the fat cook the whole town had just laughed into the mud. Mabel Rose Carter stood in front of Pike's diner with flour dust clinging to her brown dress and shame burning hot under her collar. The morning wind rolled down Main Street sharp enough to cut through wool, lifting the loose edge of the old apron Calvin Pike had dropped at her feet like it was something spoiled. Folks had stopped pretending not to look. The barber stood in his doorway with his razor towel over one shoulder. 2 ranch hands leaned against the hitching rail. Mrs. Beatrice Harlan paused outside the general store with a basket of ribbon and sugar in her arms, her mouth pinched tight in that church-going way women used when they wanted cruelty to look like concern. "I told you all," Calvin Pike called from the diner steps, loud enough for the wagons at the far end of the street to hear, "a woman built like that has no business in a kitchen unless she is eating from it." A few people laughed. Not everyone. That almost made it worse. The ones who stayed quiet still watched, and watching was its own kind of permission. Mabel bent to pick up her wooden spoon from the dust. Her fingers were steady because she made them steady. She had learned a long time ago that if people were determined to make a spectacle of you, the only power left was not giving them the tears they came to see. "I cooked every plate you sold this week, Mr. Pike," she said softly. "And you took every cent for them." Calvin smiled as if she had helped him prove his point. "Then you ought to thank me for letting your name stay off the menu." Another laugh moved through the street, thin and mean. Mabel picked up the spoon, then the apron, then the small paper sack with her last 2 biscuits inside. She did not look at Mrs. Harlan. She did not look at the barber or the ranch hands or the boys near the water trough whispering the word fat like it was a joke they had invented. She only turned toward the general store because she still needed flour, and hunger did not wait for pride to heal. That was when Thomas Whitaker rode in from the North Road with his daughter seated in front of him on the saddle. Everyone noticed Tom because people always noticed a man who had stopped belonging to the living but kept walking among them. His black coat was buttoned to the throat, his hat brim low, his jaw dark with a morning shave he had done in haste. 6-year-old Elsie sat stiff against him, clutching a faded cloth doll with yellow yarn hair. She had not spoken since the fever took her mother 2 winters ago. Briar Creek had tried everything. Peppermint candy, prayer circles, traveling doctors, songs, stern words, soft words. Elsie gave none of them so much as a whisper. Tom drew his horse to a stop when the crowd blocked the store entrance. His eyes moved from Calvin to Mabel to the flower on her sleeves. "Trouble?" he asked. "No trouble, Mr. Whitaker," Mrs. Harlan said quickly. "Just kitchen help for getting her place." Mabel kept her head high, but her grip tightened around the biscuits until the paper crinkled. Calvin gave a short laugh. "You looking for a cook, Tom? Take this one home. She can fill a doorway and a stew pot both." More laughter. Mabel stepped backward, her heel catching the edge of the boardwalk. The paper sack slipped. 1 biscuit rolled into the street and stopped beside Tom Whitaker's horse. Mabel froze. Calvin's smile widened. No one moved. Then Elsie did. The little girl slid from the saddle before Tom could stop her, landed softly in the dust, and walked straight to the biscuit. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Elsie picked it up with both hands, brushed it once against her sleeve, and carried it to Mabel. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply lifted the biscuit toward the woman everyone had mocked, as if the whole street had misunderstood something plain as daylight. Mabel stared down at her, and for the first time that morning, her steady hands trembled. Tom dismounted slowly, his eyes fixed on his daughter. "Elsie," he said, but the child did not look back. She reached for Mabel's wooden spoon. Next, placed it carefully on top of the apron, then stepped close enough that the edge of her small sleeve touched Mabel's skirt. Mrs. Harlan whispered, "Well, I never." Calvin's face hardened. "Come away from her, child. That woman is nothing but a dismissed cook." Elsie's fingers curled into Mabel's apron. Tom saw it. Mabel saw him see it. The entire town saw the silent daughter of the coldest rancher in 12 miles choose, in front of God and everybody, to stand beside the woman they had tried to shame. And Thomas Whitaker, who had come to town only for cough syrup and lamp oil, took one step into the street and looked at Mabel Carter as if she had suddenly become the answer to a question he had been too broken to ask. Tom Whitaker did not make his offer in the street. He was not the kind of man who gave people the satisfaction of watching him decide something. He lifted Elsie back onto the saddle, bought the cough syrup and lamp oil he had come for, and said nothing while Mrs. Harlan whispered behind her glove and Calvin Pike stood on the diner steps with his arms folded like a man waiting for the world to agree with him. Mabel gathered her apron, her spoon, and the biscuit Elsie had returned to her. She expected Tom to ride away. Men like him always rode away. They saw trouble, measured the cost of kindness, and chose the road with less dust on it. But when Mabel stepped toward the alley behind the general store, wondering whether the old freight shed would be dry enough to sleep in, Tom's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Carter." She turned. "It is Miss Carter." His eyes flicked to the ringless hand holding the paper sack. "Miss Carter, then." Elsie sat silent in front of him, the cloth doll tucked under one arm, her gaze fixed on Mabel as if the whole town had vanished. Tom shifted in the saddle. "Can you cook for ranch hands?" Mabel almost laughed, but it would have come out too tired. "I have cooked for miners, drovers, freight men, church socials, and men who complained with full mouths." "How many at once?" 28 if the stove holds. "My place has 12 men through supper most nights." "More at branding." "1 child." "Myself." He paused, as though the last 2 words cost him something. "I need a cook for 30 days. Calvin barked a laugh from across the street. 30 days? "Tom, she will eat your winter stores in a week." Tom did not look at him. That was the first thing Mabel noticed. He refused to give cruelty a chair at the table. "I will pay $15 for the month," he said. "Room off the back of the kitchen. Meals included. You work clean, you work steady, and you do not bring town trouble to my door." Mabel looked at Elsie, then back at him. "And when the 30 days are over? Then you leave." The answer was plain as a fence post. It should have insulted her. Instead, its honesty studied something inside her. "Why me?" she asked. Tom's jaw tightened. His gaze moved to Elsie's small hand, still clutching a corner of Mabel's apron from where she had held it in the street. "Because my daughter noticed you." Mabel swallowed. "That is not the same as needing me." "No," he said. "It is not." He swung down from the horse and stood in front of her, tall enough to block the wind. "Understand this before you answer. You cook. You sleep in the back room. You do not ask about my wife. You do not go through my things. You do not try to fix my daughter. Elsie is not your concern." The child's fingers tightened around the doll, but her face stayed still. Mabel's throat ached at the coldness of the rules, yet she had lived long enough to know that cold rules were sometimes safer than warm lies. "I came to work, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Not to be wanted." For the first time, something moved behind his eyes, quick and guarded, like a lamp seen through a shutter. He gave one short nod. "Then get your belongings." "I have them." He looked down at the apron, the spoon, and the 2 biscuits in the paper sack. He did not comment. That was the second thing she noticed. By dusk, the Whitaker Ranch rose out of the Wyoming grassland under a sky the color of worn tin. The house was sturdy but tired, with porch boards bowed by weather and windows dark enough to look abandoned. A windmill creaked near the barn. Somewhere beyond the corrals, cattle lowed in the cold. Tom helped Elsie down first. He did not offer Mabel his hand, and she was grateful for it. She climbed from the wagon with her dignity intact and followed him through the back door into a kitchen that smelled of ashes, old coffee, and silence. The stove was cold. Dust lay along the shelves. A stack of chipped plates sat beside a sink pump. Then Mabel saw it. Hanging from a peg by the pantry was a blue calico apron, faded at the hem, neatly washed, untouched by dust. The kind of apron a woman hung up after supper believing she would wear it again in the morning. Tom's voice came from behind her, low and sharp. "Do not touch that." Mabel did not move closer. She only looked at the dead woman's apron and understood, all at once, that she had not been hired into a house. She had been hired into a wound. Mabel did not touch the blue apron. She set her own worn apron on the table instead, laid the wooden spoon beside it, and looked around the kitchen the way a doctor might look over a patient who had been breathing too shallow for too long. There was no warmth in the room except the kind trapped in memory. The stove had gone dull with ash. The bread box held only a heel of hard loaf wrapped in cloth. A coffee pot sat on the back burner with a black ring burned into its bottom. 2 tin cups rested upside down near the sink, but only one had been used often. The smaller cup beside it was clean as Sunday glass. Elsie stood just inside the doorway with her doll pressed to her chest, watching every move Mabel made. Thomas Whitaker hung his hat on a peg, then seemed to remember the peg was beside the blue apron and moved his hat to the chair instead. "There are beans in the pantry," he said. "Salt pork in the cellar. Flour if mice have not found it. Coffee is in the tin." "And supper?" Mabel asked. "Beans. Again?" His eyes narrowed a little. "You have been in my kitchen for 2 minutes, Miss Carter. Long enough to smell that beans have been supper more than once this week." One of the ranch hands near the back porch gave a quiet cough that sounded dangerously close to amusement. Thomas looked toward him, and the man found sudden interest in his boots. Mabel washed her hands at the pump, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work without asking another question. She opened windows just enough to let the stale air move. She carried out the dead ashes. She coaxed kindling into flame, then fed the stove with split wood until the iron began to tick and wake. The kitchen changed by inches. Not quickly, not magically, but honestly, the way cold rooms change when someone believes they are worth warming. She found onions soft at the edges and trimmed them clean. She found potatoes in a burlap sack, small but sound. She cut salt pork thin, browned it slow, stirred flour into the grease, then added water, beans, onions, potatoes, pepper, and a pinch of dried sage from a jar pushed so far back on the shelf it seemed forgotten on purpose. Thomas stood in the doorway longer than a man needed to stand. "You do not have to make it fancy," he said. "I am not. Smells like you are. That is because somebody is finally cooking it." The ranch hand outside made the coughing sound again and wisely stepped away. Elsie had not moved. Mabel felt the child watching her hands, the knife, the spoon, the way she turned a plain supper into something that filled corners and softened boards. She did not speak to Elsie. She did not ask the child whether she was hungry. She did not smile too wide or lean too close. Children who had folded themselves into silence did not need grown folks knocking at the door of them all day long. They needed a light left on. So Mabel took a small bowl from the shelf, ladled in soup, blew across it until the steam thinned, and placed it on the end of the table nearest the kitchen door. Beside it she set half a biscuit from her paper sack, split open with a little butter melting into the middle. Then she turned her back and kept stirring the pot. Thomas noticed. Of course he noticed. Men who had been guarding sorrow for 2 years noticed everything. "She will not eat that," he said quietly. Mabel did not look at him. "Then it will cool." "Miss Carter." "I heard you, Mr. Whitaker. My daughter is not a project." The spoon paused once against the side of the pot. "No child is." The words settled between them, not sharp, not soft, just true enough to make Thomas look away first. Supper was served at the long table after dark. Ranch hands came in with washed faces and careful eyes, unsure what to do with a kitchen that smelled like a home they had not earned yet. They ate fast at first, then slower when they realized there was enough. No one mocked Mabel. Hunger made honest men out of most of them. Thomas ate standing by the counter until Mabel set a plate in front of the empty chair at the head of the table. He sat because refusing would have made the room louder than obeying. Elsie remained by the doorway. Her bowl stayed untouched until no one was watching her directly. Then, while Mabel rinsed plates and Thomas stepped onto the porch to speak with his foreman, the little girl crossed the room on silent feet. She picked up the biscuit first. A crumb fell onto her dress. She stared at it as if waiting to be scolded. No one scolded her. She took one bite, then another. By the time the lamp burned low, the bowl was empty. Near dawn, Thomas came in from checking a restless horse and stopped cold at the kitchen threshold. The small bowl sat clean on the table, the spoon laid neatly beside it. On the braided rug by the stove, wrapped in Mabel Carter's old brown shawl, Elsie slept with her cheek against her cloth doll and one small hand resting on the hem of Mabel's apron. By the second morning, the Whitaker kitchen no longer sounded like an empty room pretending to be useful. The stove snapped softly with fresh fire. Coffee warmed in the pot without burning. Dough rested under a clean towel on the table, rising slow and patient in the heat. Mabel moved through the room with flour on her wrists and her hair pinned back in a way that made her look more determined than pretty, though Thomas Whitaker caught himself noticing the calm shape of her face when she was not bracing for laughter. He did not like noticing. Not yet. Elsie sat on the bottom stair with her doll in her lap, watching Mabel cut biscuit dough into rounds with the rim of a tin cup. The child had returned there after breakfast without being called, dressed in the same gray wool dress she wore most days, her pale hair combed but already slipping loose around her cheeks. Thomas stood outside by the water pump, pretending to mend a strap that did not need mending, his eyes traveling again and again to the kitchen window. He had seen Elsie eat the night before. He had told himself hunger had done it. Hunger, warmth, chance, anything but hope. Hope was a dangerous thing on a ranch that had already buried too much of it. Mabel set a small plate near the end of the table. Not in front of Elsie. Not so close it asked anything of her. Just near enough for the smell of butter and warm bread to reach the stairs. On the plate were 3 small pieces of biscuit, each one split and brushed with honey so thin it shone like morning light. Beside them lay a folded napkin with a little blue flower stitched in one corner. Mabel had found it at the bottom of a drawer, washed it, and pressed it flat with her palm. Thomas saw the napkin and went still. It had belonged to his wife, Clara. Elsie saw it too. Her small fingers tightened around the doll, but she did not run away. Mabel kept her back turned, humming under her breath while she stirred oatmeal for the ranch hands. It was not a song anyone would know, just a low, steady sound that filled the spaces words might have frightened. Elsie rose from the stair. One step, then another. Her boots made no sound on the boards. She reached the table and stared at the napkin for so long Thomas nearly walked in and stopped the whole thing. Then Elsie touched the blue flower with one finger. Mabel did not turn around. The child picked up a piece of biscuit and took a bite. Thomas gripped the leather strap until his knuckles went pale. Elsie chewed, swallowed, and took the second piece. The third she held for a moment, then carried it across the kitchen. Mabel was lifting the oatmeal pot from the stove when Elsie came beside her and tugged, just once, at her sleeve. Mabel froze. Not because the tug was frightening, but because it was careful. Asking. Trusting. She looked down slowly. Elsie held up the biscuit. For a breath, neither one moved. Then Mabel crouched with a soft rustle of skirt, making herself smaller, not crowding the child. Elsie placed the biscuit in Mabel's flour-dusted hand, as if sharing food was the only language she still remembered. Mabel smiled, but not too much. "Thank you kindly," she said. Elsie did not answer. She only touched the edge of Mabel's sleeve again, then went back to the table and sat in the chair nearest the stove. When Thomas entered, the air changed. Elsie looked at him, guarded, as though she expected the moment to be taken away. Mabel stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "Breakfast is near ready." Thomas did not look at the oatmeal. He looked at the empty plate, the honey shine on Elsie's fingers, the chair she had chosen, the color in her cheeks. He had paid doctors from Cheyenne to Laramie. He had carried her through snow to a preacher who promised prayer could loosen grief. He had bought peppermint sticks, picture books, a music box from Denver, and every one of them had failed to bring his little girl one step closer to the world. Mabel Carter had done it with a biscuit and a napkin. His voice came out low. "What did you do to her?" Mabel's face closed a little, not in anger, but in old defense. "I fed her." No, he stepped farther into the kitchen. "I have fed her. Mrs. Harlan has fed her. Half this county has tried to feed her." Mabel looked toward Elsie, then lowered her voice. Maybe they all wanted her to prove she was getting better. Thomas said nothing. Mabel picked up the empty plate and held it carefully, like the proof of something fragile. "I only let her be hungry in peace." The words landed harder than accusation. Thomas looked at his daughter, who was now pressing one small thumb into the stitched blue flower on the napkin. He had no answer. Outside, the ranch hands began coming toward the house, drawn by the smell of breakfast, boots loud on frozen ground. Inside, Elsie reached for another biscuit without being asked, and Thomas Whitaker stood in his own kitchen feeling, for the first time in 2 years, that the silence in his house might not be permanent. By the 5th day, the Whitaker ranch had begun telling on itself. Men who used to swallow breakfast in silence now lingered over coffee. Boots were scraped cleaner before crossing Mabel's kitchen floor. Someone left a bundle of split kindling by the stove every morning without being asked. Elsie still did not speak, but she came closer now, one small inch at a time, carrying her cloth doll under one arm like a witness. Thomas saw all of it, and the more he saw, the more uneasy he became. Hope had entered his house wearing a brown dress and flower on her sleeves, and he did not yet trust it. That afternoon, while Mabel kneaded bread at the table, a rider came from town with a sack of oats and a mouthful of news. His name was Lem Turner, a wiry hand who worked fence lines when he needed money and repeated gossip when he needed attention. He leaned in the back doorway and said, "Pike is telling folks you were dismissed for stealing sugar and spoiling meat." The kitchen went still. One of the ranch hands looked down at his plate. Another muttered for Lem to shut his mouth. Mabel kept kneading. Her hands pressed, folded, turned, pressed again. "Is that so?" she said. Lem shifted. "I figured Mr. Whitaker ought to know what kind of talk is running." Thomas stood by the pantry shelf, one hand resting on a tin of coffee. His eyes moved to Mabel. She did not plead. She did not defend herself. Somehow that troubled him more than if she had. "Did you steal from him?" Thomas asked. The question came out colder than he meant it to. Mabel's hands stopped in the dough. Elsie sat beneath the table with her doll, hidden by the hanging cloth, but Mabel knew she was there. "No," Mabel said. "Did you spoil his meat?" "No." "Then why is he saying it?" Her shoulders rose once with a breath. "Because men like Calvin Pike understand that a lie gets farther when it is told about a woman folks already want to laugh at." No one spoke. Mabel reached for the flour crock, and her sleeve slipped back. Thomas saw the pale marks along her wrist then, old kitchen burns, small and round, the kind made by grease, stove doors, and years of work done too quickly for too little thanks. He stepped forward. Before thinking, Mabel pulled her sleeve down. "Leave it," she said quietly. "Those are old." "How old?" "Old enough not to matter." "That is not an answer." She looked at him then, really looked, and the guarded softness in her face hardened into something that was not anger, but dignity refusing to kneel. "I worked at Pike's Diner for 11 months. I opened before sunrise. I closed after the last drunk found his way out. I cooked stew, pies, biscuits, roast chicken, coffee, and breakfast plates for men who praised the food until they learned my hands made it. Calvin kept my wages in a ledger I was never allowed to see. When supplies went missing, he named me. When customers complained, he pointed at me. When I asked for what he owed, he laughed in front of the whole room and said feeding me was payment enough." Thomas's jaw tightened. Mabel turned back to the bread because looking at pity was harder than looking at dough. "My father called me a burden before I knew what the word meant. School children called me names before I could spell them. Women in church smiled at my face and measured my plate with their eyes. After a while, you learn the shape of a room before anyone says a word. You know where to stand so you take up less space. You know when to lower your voice. You know how to become useful enough that folks tolerate breathing the same air." The bread dough sagged under her palms. Her voice did not break. "That made it worse." Thomas said, "Why did you not tell me?" Mabel gave a small, tired smile. "Men do not usually ask women like me for the truth. They just decide what fits." Beneath the table, Elsie's doll slipped from her lap and landed softly on the floor. Mabel heard it. Thomas heard it. The little girl had crawled out just far enough that her face showed under the cloth, pale and stricken, her eyes fixed on Mabel as if she understood every word even without answering one. Mabel knelt slowly and picked up the doll, brushing flour from its yarn hair. "It is all right, sweetheart," she whispered. "I know what it means to be in a room and still not be heard." Elsie reached for the doll, but instead of taking it, she placed her small hand over Mabel's flour-white fingers. Thomas stood above them with the coffee tin still in his hand, and for the first time since Mabel Carter crossed his threshold, suspicion felt like a shameful thing. By the second week, the Whitaker Ranch had begun to wake before the sun for reasons other than work. Light came through the kitchen windows and found bread already cooling on the table, coffee hot but never scorched, eggs cracked into a bowl, and Elsie sitting on a flour sack near the stove with her doll across her knees. She still did not speak, but silence was no longer the same thing as absence. She pointed now. She chose now. She reached for the blue-flowered napkin each morning and placed it beside her plate as if claiming a small piece of the day. Mabel never made a ceremony of it. She only poured milk, cut bread, and left room beside her for the child to come closer if she wished. Thomas noticed that too. He noticed everything he had tried not to notice. He noticed how the ranch hands lowered their voices when Elsie came into the room. He noticed how they thanked Mabel before leaving the table. He noticed how the house smelled of cinnamon on cold mornings and stew on hard nights. He noticed that he had stopped eating with his hat beside his plate, ready to leave, and had begun sitting until the lamp burned low. One evening, Mabel found Elsie's cloth doll with a torn dress and one yarn braid nearly loose. She sat at the kitchen table after supper with a needle, thread, and a scrap from her own brown apron. Elsie stood beside her chair, watching with wide eyes. "A lady ought to have a strong hem," Mabel said softly, holding the doll up for inspection. "Even a small lady made of cloth." Elsie touched the new patch, then touched the matching place on Mabel's apron. Her mouth moved once, but no sound came. Mabel did not ask for one. She simply handed the doll back. Elsie hugged it hard, then placed it in Mabel's lap as if the doll had chosen where it belonged. Thomas saw from the doorway. Something in his face changed, then hid itself again. The next afternoon, trouble came in a polished wagon with red wheels and church ribbons tied to the side rails. Mrs. Beatrice Harlan stepped down first, wearing her good black gloves and the expression of a woman arriving to save a household that had not asked to be saved. Behind her came two women from the Ladies' Aid Society and Calvin Pike, clean-shaven, smiling, carrying a folded paper in his coat pocket like a preacher with a sermon. Mabel was hanging dish towels on the line when she saw them. Elsie stood beside her, holding wooden clothespins in both hands. The child moved closer to Mabel without being told. Beatrice looked at that closeness and sighed, as though someone had placed a dirty plate on a lace tablecloth. "Mr. Whitaker," she called when Thomas came from the barn. "We came as concerned friends." Thomas wiped his hands on a work rag. "Concern usually writes before it visits." Calvin smiled. "This will not take long." His eyes slid to Mabel. "We heard you were keeping my former kitchen girl here under a misunderstanding." Mabel kept her chin level. "I am not your anything, Mr. Pike." One of the women drew in a quick breath. Beatrice stepped forward. "No one wants unpleasantness, Miss Carter. But a child without a mother is vulnerable. People notice when a woman with no standing settles herself into a widower's kitchen and makes herself necessary." Thomas's gaze sharpened. "Say what you came to say." Beatrice turned to Elsie, and her voice softened in a way that made Mabel colder than shouting would have. "Sweet child, your real mama would be ashamed to see a stranger wearing down your grief for her own comfort." Elsie went still. The clothespins slipped from her hands and scattered across the hard ground. Mabel dropped to one knee at once, not touching her, just near enough to be found. Thomas took one step forward. His voice was quiet. "Leave my daughter out of this." Calvin unfolded the paper. "Tomorrow is Sunday. The church committee will hear what kind of woman you have brought into this house. Folks deserve to know whether their daughters and children are safe around someone dismissed for theft and deceit." Mabel's face went pale, but she stood. "I will not have Elsie dragged through town gossip because of me." Thomas looked at her then, and the wind moved between them, sharp with the smell of coming snow. Before he could answer, Elsie reached down, picked up one fallen clothespin, and pressed it into Mabel's hand like a promise she did not yet have words for. Sunday came gray and windless, the kind of morning that made every sound travel too far. Thomas hitched the wagon before breakfast, though no one in the kitchen had much appetite. Mabel packed biscuits in a cloth because her hands needed work, and Elsie stood beside her in a blue wool dress Mabel had brushed until the nap shone soft. The child held her patched doll in one arm and the blue-flowered napkin in the other, folded small against her chest. Thomas watched them from the doorway, his coat buttoned, his hat in his hand. "You do not have to go," he said to Mabel. She tied the biscuit cloth closed. "If I stay away, they will say that proves I am guilty. Let them talk. They already do." He looked at Elsie then, and his voice lowered. "I will not have her hurt by this." Mabel's fingers stilled on the knot. "Neither will I." That was why she had already made her choice. She did not say it aloud in the kitchen, not with Elsie watching, not with the stove warm behind her and the smell of bread in the air, but the choice sat heavy in her pocket like a folded letter. If the town demanded someone leave, it would be her. The church in Briar Creek was full before the bell stopped ringing. People filled the pews in their Sunday black, faces turned with the eager solemnity of folks who had dressed gossip up as duty. Mrs. Beatrice Harlan sat near the front with the Ladies' Aid Society arranged around her like a row of polished buttons. Calvin Pike stood beside the stove with his folded paper in hand, smiling softly at anyone who looked his way. Mabel walked in behind Thomas, not beside him, because she knew how people measured distance. Elsie walked between them, one small hand holding Thomas's sleeve and the other clutching her doll. Whispers rose, thinned, and settled. Mabel kept her eyes on the pulpit. Reverend Cole cleared his throat. "We're here to settle concerns brought before the committee regarding Miss Mabel Carter's position in the Whitaker household." The word position passed through the room in a way that made several women lower their eyes and still listen harder. Calvin spoke first. He told the same story he had been polishing for days, every lie smooth as butter. Missing sugar. Spoiled meat. Unpaid debt. A cook who took advantage of kindness and then cried shame when asked to leave. Mabel stood with her hands folded. She could feel Thomas beside her, still as fence wire drawn tight. She could feel Elsie pressed close against his coat. Beatrice rose next. Her voice trembled in just the right places. "No one questions Mr. Whitaker's loneliness," she said. "But loneliness makes a household weak. And a motherless child can be confused by any woman who feeds her, especially one eager to lift herself above her proper station." Mabel heard the small sound that came from Elsie, not a word, not even a cry, just breath caught where speech should have been. Thomas shifted, but Mabel moved first. She stepped into the aisle and untied her apron. The room watched. Slowly, carefully, she folded it once, then again, and placed it on the end of the pew. "Reverend," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "I will not be the reason this child is spoken of in public like a problem to be solved. I came to cook. I did my work. I will collect nothing more than what is fair, and I will leave the Whitaker ranch before sundown." Thomas turned toward her. "Mabel." She did not look at him because looking would undo her. "It is all right, Mr. Whitaker." But it was not all right. Not to Elsie. The little girl broke from her father's side and ran down the aisle, her boots striking the floorboards louder than any sermon bell. Gasps lifted from the pews. Mabel turned just in time for Elsie to throw both arms around her waist and press her face into the front of her dress. Mabel froze, hands hovering in the air, afraid even now to take what was not freely given. The church went silent. Elsie clung harder. Her small shoulders shook once, then steadied. She lifted her face. Her mouth opened. For 2 years, Briar Creek had heard nothing from that child but footsteps and breathing. Now her voice came out thin, rough, and bright. As a match struck in a dark room. "Mama." No one moved. The word did not sound like forgetting. It did not erase the woman buried on the hill beyond the ranch. It sounded like a door opening in a house everyone had thought was locked forever. Mabel's face crumpled, but she did not weep. She only lowered her hands and held Elsie as gently as if the child were made of flame. Thomas stood in the aisle with his hat crushed between both hands, staring at his daughter, then at Mabel, and in his eyes was the terrible, beautiful knowledge that he could no longer call this woman only his cook. Calvin Pike was the first to break the silence, because men like him feared quiet more than shouting. "That child is confused," he said, his smile gone thin around the edges. "You all heard it. She has been coached." Elsie turned her face deeper into Mabel's dress, and the movement carried more truth than any answer the room deserved. Mabel's arms tightened around her, not possessive, not claiming, only sheltering. "Please," Mabel said softly, though no one seemed sure who she was pleading with. "Do not make her carry this." Calvin stepped into the aisle with the folded paper still in his hand. "Mr. Whitaker, take your daughter away from that woman before more damage is done." Thomas lifted his head. The man who had entered the church that morning had been cold, careful, and tired from 2 years of guarding a grave with every breath. The man who stood now looked neither tired nor uncertain. He set his hat on the pew beside him and walked down the aisle, slow enough that every bootstep found the floorboards and stayed there. Calvin tried to hold his ground, but Thomas did not stop until he stood between him and Mabel. "You have said enough." Calvin gave a short laugh. "I have told the truth." "No," Thomas said. "You told a story that made you comfortable." Mrs. Harlan rose halfway from her pew. "Mr. Whitaker, the committee has a duty to consider the character of the woman living under your roof." Thomas looked at her then, and his voice stayed level. That made the room listen harder. "Then consider it properly. She came into my house with 1 apron, 1 spoon, and less pride than this town had already taken from her. She cooked for my men before she ate. She warmed a kitchen I had let go cold. She never asked my daughter for a word. She never asked me for kindness. She gave both anyway." Mabel stared at him over Elsie's pale hair, her face caught between disbelief and the ache of wanting to believe. Calvin pointed at the folded paper. "I have witnesses." "So do I." Thomas turned slightly toward the pews. "Every man on my ranch has eaten from her hands and worked better for it. Every person in this church just watched my daughter speak for the first time in 2 years. You may call that confusion if it suits you. I call it mercy." The Reverend lowered his eyes. A ranch hand near the back whispered, "Amen," before he seemed to realize he had spoken. Beatrice's mouth tightened. "Your late wife was a good woman. Are you truly going to let this stranger take her place?" The question landed hard. Mabel flinched as if it had found the tenderest place in the room. Thomas looked toward the church window, where the hill road bent north toward the cemetery beyond his land. When he spoke again, his voice had roughened, but it did not break. "Clara Whitaker has her place. No one here gets to use her memory as a weapon against a woman who has shown my child tenderness." Elsie lifted her head at her mother's name, but she did not let go of Mabel. Thomas saw that and nodded once, as if the child had given him the last piece of courage he needed. Calvin moved as if to step around him. "The girl should come here and answer for herself." Thomas shifted one boot, not touching him, only becoming a wall no one with sense would test. "No one crowds my daughter." Calvin's face reddened. "And what about your cook?" Thomas looked back at Mabel. For a moment the whole church seemed to disappear, leaving only the woman with flour still worked into the seams of her hands and the child holding fast to her skirt. "She was my cook," he said. "Then she became my daughter's voice. Now she is the heart of my home." No one breathed. Thomas faced the room again. "She stays." 2 words. Plain. Final. Stronger than any sermon that had ever been preached inside those walls. Mabel lowered her face, and this time the tears came, quiet and clean, not because she had been shamed, but because someone had stood in front of the shame and refused to move. Reverend Cole closed Calvin's folded paper without reading another line. One by one, the people of Briar Creek looked away. The barber studied his boots. The ladies' aid women folded their gloved hands. Mrs. Harlan sat down as if the weight of the room had finally found her shoulders. Thomas picked up Mabel's apron from the pew and held it out to her. She took it with trembling fingers. Elsie pressed close between them, still silent again, but not empty. Outside, the church bell rope swayed in the wind, and for the first time since Mabel Carter had come to Briar Creek, the town had nothing left to say. Spring did not arrive at the Whitaker Ranch all at once. It came in small mercies. Ice loosening from the water trough. Mud softening under wagon wheels. green showing along the fence line where everyone had believed the ground too tired to try again. Mabel stayed through the last hard weeks of winter, then through the thaw, then through the first morning Elsie walked into the kitchen and asked for honey in a voice so small Thomas had to set his coffee down before his hand gave him away. Words returned to the child the way light returns to a room, not in a blaze, but line by line across the floor. Biscuit. Doll. Papa. Stay. And sometimes, when sleep made her brave or happiness caught her unguarded, Mama. Mabel never answered that word too quickly. She always looked first at the photograph on the mantel, where Clara Whitaker smiled from behind a silver frame, soft-eyed and forever young. Mabel dusted that frame every Friday. She set fresh wildflowers beneath it when the pasture bloomed. She told Elsie stories about kindness being wide enough to hold the living and the lost together. No one was replaced in that house. That was what made it holy. Thomas changed more quietly than the season did. He repaired the porch rail that had leaned for 2 years. He painted the kitchen door blue because Elsie liked the color. He built a low shelf beside the stove for Mabel's mixing bowls, then pretended it had simply needed doing. He stopped standing in doorways like a man ready to leave his own life. He sat at the table after supper and listened while Elsie sounded out words from an old primer, her finger moving slowly under each line. Mabel would mend or peel apples or shape dough beside them, and every now and then Thomas would look up and catch the lamplight on her face. He never saw what Briar Creek had claimed to see. He saw the woman who had entered a dead kitchen and taught it to breathe. One evening in June, after the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and fireflies blinked over the pasture, Thomas found Mabel washing flour from her hands at the pump. The window stood open behind her. Inside, Elsie was arranging 3 plates on the table and humming off-key, proud of every broken note. Thomas held something in his hand, turning it once before offering it to Mabel. It was not a fancy ring. Just plain gold, warm from his palm. Mabel stared at it, then at him. Thomas. I know what folks might say. I do not care what folks say. His mouth almost smiled. I am learning that. He stepped closer, leaving proper space between them, but not the old distance. I am not asking you to fill an empty place. I am asking if you will take the place that became yours while I was too stubborn to name it. Mabel looked through the window at Elsie, who had placed the blue-flowered napkin beside the 3rd plate. Her eyes shone, but her voice stayed steady. And if I say yes? Thomas looked toward the kitchen, toward the stove, the bread, the child, the photograph on the mantel, the home that had found its heartbeat again. Then you stay because you choose to. Not because you need work. Not because my daughter needs saving. Because this is your home too. Mabel opened her hand. He placed the ring there gently as if trust had weight. Before either of them could speak again, Elsie appeared at the door in her nightgown, barefoot and bright-eyed. She looked at the ring, then at Mabel, then took Mabel's hand in both of hers. Stay, Mama, she said. This time Mabel answered.